What if the person you trusted the most, the one who called you family, was secretly calculating the value of your death? In 2003, deep in the misty mountains of Taiwan, a woman in a pink dress was found lying lifeless on a remote hillside. At first, it looked like a brutal murder. But when police began pulling the threads of the case, they uncovered something far more terrifying. A man who had spent nearly 2 decades turning his own family into insurance payouts. And this woman was only the latest victim. In the humid, fog-covered mountains of central Taiwan lies Nantou County, a rugged region surrounded by steep peaks and thick forests. It's the only county on the island that doesn't touch the ocean. The mountains dominate everything here. The weather changes quickly, and the dense wilderness makes it an easy place for secrets to disappear. On the afternoon of May 13, 2003, that quiet wilderness was suddenly disturbed. A middle-aged couple had driven into the hills near Hungshan to collect wild medicinal herbs. It was a peaceful routine they had done many times before. The forest was silent except for the wind brushing through bamboo leaves. But halfway up the hillside, something caught their attention. At first, they only saw a pair of bare feet sticking out from the brush. The woman immediately assumed it was harmless. Maybe a mannequin. Sometimes clothing stores dumped old display models in remote areas. But her husband felt something was wrong. The color of the skin, the unnatural stillness. It didn't look like plastic. Driven by a growing sense of dread, they moved closer. And within seconds, the illusion shattered. This wasn't a mannequin. It was a dead body. Panic took over. The couple rushed down the mountain and called the police. Because of the rough terrain and winding roads, it took investigators a long time to reach the location. When they finally arrived, officers had to hike through the forest to reach the hillside. And what they found there was deeply disturbing. Lying face down on the damp ground was the body of a woman. Her hands were tied tightly behind her back with rope. She was wearing a pink one-piece dress, something that looked completely out of place in the wild mountain terrain. Her dress had been pulled upward. She wasn't wearing any underwear. It was immediately clear that the victim had been brutally assaulted before death. The back of her head had a massive depression fracture, as if something heavy had smashed into her skull. Her long black hair was soaked with dried blood. There were scratches across her arms and legs, signs that she had fought desperately before dying. Her fingertips had turned dark purple, a sign she had been deprived of oxygen, which meant investigators suspected something even more disturbing. She hadn't just been beaten, she had likely been strangled. As detectives documented the scene, they noticed something else. Her earlobes were pierced, but her earrings were missing. On her wrist was a pale line where a watch had clearly been worn for years. But the watch was gone. Robbery was likely involved. Yet another strange clue appeared on her left palm. Written in ink were 7 digits. A phone number. At that moment, the police didn't yet realize it. But those 7 numbers would lead them to a man hiding one of the darkest secrets in Taiwanese criminal history. Because the killer of the woman in the pink dress was not just a murderer, he was something far worse. When the police released the description of the victim to the media, they hoped someone would recognize her. Female, mid-40s, about 5 feet 2 inches tall, wearing a pink dress. It didn't take long. Just one day after the discovery, a man walked into a police station miles away from the crime scene. He looked exhausted. His voice was shaking. He told the officer on duty that his daughter had been missing for 3 days. Her name was Chen Ruiqin. She was 45 years old and the successful owner of a local restaurant. Detectives immediately escorted the man to the morgue. It is a moment no parent should ever experience. When the sheet was slowly pulled back, the man collapsed. Through tears, he confirmed the worst possible truth. The woman found on the hillside was indeed his daughter. Once he was able to compose himself, Chen Ruiqin's father began explaining what had happened before she disappeared. On the morning of May 11th, 2 days before her body was discovered, Ruiqin told the family she was going out to handle some business. She didn't explain where she was going. She didn't say who she was meeting, but her father remembered exactly what she was wearing. A pink dress. a light jacket, high heels, and she carried a handbag. Everything matched perfectly with the body found on the mountain. He also remembered something unusual. Just as Yanlin was leaving the house, he noticed she had forgotten her mobile phone. He ran outside to give it to her, and that was when he saw her stop by the roadside and hail a taxi. She didn't meet anyone there. No one picked her up. She simply got into the taxi and disappeared down the street. It was the last time he ever saw his daughter alive. The father then mentioned something else that caught the detective's attention. Yanlin had been wearing several expensive pieces of jewelry that day. A Rolex watch, diamond earrings, and a platinum necklace. None of those items were found on the body. That matched the clues investigators had already noticed at the crime scene. The missing jewelry suggested robbery, but detectives knew the situation might be more complicated. Because statistically, in many homicide cases involving women, the killer is someone the victim already knows. Chen Yanlin had been married once before. Her ex-husband's name was Lu Li. The marriage didn't last long. According to the father, the relationship collapsed because Lu Li was unstable financially and lacked ambition. Even after the divorce, however, Lu Li never truly disappeared from Yanlin's life. They had a son together, so he still visited frequently. But according to the father, everyone knew the real reason. Lu Li was jealous. Yanlin's restaurant business had become very successful. She had money, she had independence, and she had started dating other men. Men who were far more successful than Lu Li had ever been. The father revealed that Lu Li had repeatedly begged Yanlin to marry him again, but she always refused. The situation became especially tense during the most recent Lunar New Year. Lu Li had come to the family home to visit. At the same time, one of Yanlin's new suitors arrived to pick her up. Watching his ex-wife leave with another man triggered something inside him. Lu Li became furious. He started asking aggressive questions about the new boyfriend. Later, he even confronted the couple in public. He shouted that only he had the right to be Yanlin's husband, and that their son would never accept another man as a father. The scene was so embarrassing that Yanlin later went directly to Lu Li's house and yelled at him to leave her alone. Then the father revealed one final piece of information, and it changed everything. On the morning Yanlin disappeared, shortly after she left the house, Lu Li suddenly arrived. When he heard she had just taken a taxi, he immediately rushed outside and ran in the same direction. The father didn't know if he managed to catch up to her, but from that moment on, Yanlin was never seen alive again. For detectives, the picture suddenly became very clear. A jealous ex-husband, financial problems, a history of harassment, and he had been seen chasing after the victim on the very day she vanished. It was the perfect motive. The police immediately tracked down Lu Li and brought him in for questioning. First, he didn't deny anything. Yes, he had gone to Yanlin's house that morning. Yes, he had chased after her taxi. But what he said next would completely derail the investigation. Because according to Lu Li, he never caught up with her. And even more surprising, he claimed he had an airtight alibi. One that placed him hundreds of miles away at the time of the murder. If his story was true, then the police had just lost their main suspect. And the killer of the woman in the pink dress was still out there. Detectives quickly brought Lu Li in for questioning. At first, the man didn't deny anything. Yes, he had gone to Yanlin's house on the morning of May 11th. Yes, he had chased after the taxi she got into. But according to him, by the time he reached the main road, the taxi had already disappeared from sight. He said he searched the nearby streets for a while, but he couldn't find it. Eventually, he gave up and went back home. If the story ended there, police would have had every reason to believe he was lying. A jealous ex-husband, financial problems, a history of emotional outbursts, everything pointed to him. But then Lu Li said something that surprised everyone in the room. On his way back home that morning, he claimed he had run into an old friend. The friend's name was Zhang Jun. Zhang Jun worked at a factory in Pingdong County. During their conversation, Zhang mentioned that the factory was currently short on workers and asked Lu Li if he wanted to try the job. At first, Lu Li said he refused. He had never been known as someone who liked steady work. But then an idea crossed his mind. If he could finally hold down a stable job, maybe he could win Yanlin back. Maybe she would agree to remarry him. So that same day, he decided to travel with Zhang Jun to the factory. According to his statement, starting on May 11th, he stayed in the factory dormitory and worked there for the rest of the week. For detectives, the story sounded almost too convenient. They suspected it might be a carefully constructed lie. So a team of officers was immediately sent to Pingdong to verify his story. They interviewed Zhang Jun. They spoke with the factory manager. They checked the dormitory records. And one by one, every detail in Lu Li's story matched perfectly. Multiple workers confirmed that Lu Li had arrived at the factory on May 11th, which meant that at the time Chen Yanlin was murdered on the hillside in Nantou, Lu Li was already hundreds of miles away. His alibi was solid. Within days, investigators had lost their primary suspect. If it wasn't the jealous ex-husband, then who killed Chen Yanlin? Detectives were forced to widen the investigation. They began examining every person connected to the victim: customers from her restaurant, business partners, friends, and the men she had dated after her divorce. The suspect list quickly grew to more than 50 names. For investigators, it was a nightmare. Teams of officers began interviewing each person one by one, but progress was painfully slow, and the case soon began to stall, until one detective decided to review the forensic report again. He focused on a small detail that most people had overlooked: the 7 numbers written in ink on the victim's left palm. In 2003, mobile phones already existed, but many people still wrote phone numbers on their hands so they wouldn't forget them. The detective started to think, what if this wasn't some mysterious code? What if it was simply a phone number? Police entered the number into the telecommunications system. The result made them pause. It was indeed a landline phone number. With help from the telecom company, investigators traced the line to an address: a rented house in Shurui village, located in Jiani County, about 60 kilometers from where the body had been found. The person who rented that house was a man named Chen Ruiqin. At the same time, another investigative team reviewing phone records made a second discovery. In the days before her death, Yanlin had received 3 calls from public payphones. Detectives decided to review security cameras near those phone booths. Grainy surveillance footage was pulled from nearby stores, and soon, something unusual appeared. In all 3 separate calls, a silver sedan could be seen parked nearby. The cameras showed the driver stepping out of the car, walking to the payphone, and making the call. Police quickly ran the vehicle's license plate. When the registration appeared on the screen, the detectives exchanged silent looks, because the car was registered to the same man, Chen Ruiqin. The man who rented the house connected to the number written on the victim's hand. Investigators pulled Chen Ruiqin's records from the national database. At first glance, he looked like a model citizen, a former military officer, a government employee, a man who regularly visited temples and participated in charity work. But when detectives began digging deeper into his past, they uncovered a disturbing pattern. Over the years, 2 of his wives had died, and 3 of his sons had also died. Every single death had been ruled an accident. But when investigators looked closer, a chilling detail emerged. Each death had been followed by a large insurance payout. At that moment, detectives began asking themselves a horrifying question. If Chen Ruiqin had murdered Chen Yanlin, then what about the deaths of his wives and sons? Were they really accidents? Or were they perfectly executed murders that had remained hidden for nearly 20 years? Once the name Chen Ruiqin appeared in the investigation, detectives immediately began looking for him. But there was a problem. According to local records, Chen Ruiqin wasn't at home. He was in the hospital. Just days earlier, he had been admitted after complaining about severe stomach pain. At first glance, it seemed like an unfortunate coincidence. But experienced investigators knew something important. When suspects begin to feel pressure from an investigation, some of them suddenly become very sick. So a team of detectives decided to visit the hospital immediately. They wanted to speak with Chen Ruiqin face to face. When officers entered the hospital room, they found a man lying quietly in bed. He looked calm, almost too calm. Chen Ruiqin greeted the detectives politely. He didn't seem nervous. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, he appeared almost confident. When investigators asked if he knew Chen Ruiqin, he nodded without hesitation. Yes, he admitted that he knew her, but according to him, their relationship was purely business. He claimed that he had been planning to invest money into her restaurant. He said they had spoken several times on the phone to discuss the opportunity, and that was why his number might have been written down somewhere. To detectives, the explanation sounded possible, but something still didn't feel right, so they continued asking questions. Where had he been on May 11th? Chen Ruiqin answered calmly. He said he had been at home most of the day. Later that evening, he claimed he began feeling severe stomach pain and eventually came to the hospital. Again, nothing in his story sounded obviously suspicious. But detectives had already learned something in this case. The truth often hides in small details. While speaking with Chen Ruiqin, one detective noticed something on the bedside table. A watch. It was partially hidden beneath a small towel. At first, it seemed unimportant, but the detective asked a simple question. Is that your watch? Chen Ruiqin paused for a moment. Then he said yes. He casually picked it up and showed it to the officers. It was a Rolex, and that immediately triggered an alarm in the detective's mind. Because Chen Ruiqin's father had clearly stated that his daughter had been wearing a Rolex watch the day she disappeared. The detective politely asked if he could take a closer look. Chen Ruiqin hesitated, just for a second. But in an investigation, 1 second of hesitation can say everything. The watch was examined carefully, and on the inner clasp, there was a tiny engraving. 3 characters, Chen Ruiqin. The atmosphere inside the hospital room changed instantly. The polite conversation was over. Detectives placed the watch on the table and looked directly at Chen Ruiqin. They asked him one simple question. If this watch belongs to you, why does it have Chen Ruiqin's name engraved on it? For the first time since they entered the room, Chen Ruiqin's expression changed. His calm smile disappeared. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he finally spoke. But the explanation he gave only made things worse. He claimed that Chen Ruiqin had given him the watch as a gift. According to him, she had owed him money from a business deal, so she supposedly gave him the Rolex as payment. The story sounded weak, very weak, because investigators already knew something else. When Chen Ruiqin's body was discovered, all of her jewelry was missing. The Rolex, the diamond earrings, the platinum necklace, and now one of those items had suddenly appeared in the hospital room of a man who had secretly been calling her from public payphones. At that moment, detectives made their decision. Chen Ruiqin was placed under arrest inside the hospital room. But what investigators didn't know yet was that this man was hiding something far darker than a single murder. Because once they began searching his house, they would uncover evidence suggesting that Chen Ruiqin might not be responsible for just one death, but for many more. And the truth behind those deaths would shock the entire country. After Chen Ruiqin was arrested in the hospital, detectives immediately obtained a search warrant for his home. What they were about to find would completely change the scale of the investigation. At first glance, the house looked ordinary, clean, organized. Nothing seemed unusual, but experienced investigators know something important. The most dangerous criminals often live the most ordinary-looking lives. So detectives began searching every room carefully. Drawers, closets, cabinets, and then, inside a locked cabinet in the bedroom, they found something that immediately caught their attention. A thick stack of insurance documents. At first, the files looked like normal financial paperwork. But when detectives began reading them more closely, they noticed something strange. Every policy listed Chen Ruiqin as the beneficiary. and the insured individuals were his family members, his wives, and his sons. Investigators began organizing the files on the table. One policy, then another, and another. Soon the room fell silent, because the pattern was impossible to ignore. Each insurance policy had been purchased shortly before one of his family members died, and every death had officially been recorded as an accident. Records showed that Chen Ruiqin's first wife had died many years earlier. According to the police report at the time, she had fallen down a staircase. It had been ruled an unfortunate accident. But just 2 weeks before her death, Chen Ruiqin had purchased a large life insurance policy in her name. After she died, he received a substantial payout. At the time, no one questioned it. Years later, tragedy struck again. Chen Ruiqin's second wife died after allegedly falling into a river. Again, investigators at the time believed it was accidental. But the pattern repeated itself. Just 1 month before her death, Chen Ruiqin had purchased another life insurance policy. And once again, he collected the money. But the most disturbing discoveries involved his children. One of his sons had reportedly drowned while swimming. Another had died in what was described as a sudden illness. And a third son had been involved in what was classified as an accidental fall. Each death had its own tragic story. But when detectives lined up the insurance policies next to the dates of death, the pattern became undeniable. Before each death, there was a new insurance policy, and after each death, Chen Ruiqin received another payout. The more detectives examined the documents, the more horrifying the picture became. For nearly 2 decades, Chen Ruiqin had appeared to be a man cursed by terrible misfortune, a husband who had lost 2 wives, a father who had buried 3 sons. Neighbors had pitied him. Friends had sympathized with him. But now investigators began to suspect a far darker truth. What if none of those deaths were accidents? What if they were all carefully planned murders? Murders committed for insurance money. When Chen Ruiqin was confronted with the evidence, he remained calm, almost unnervingly calm. Detectives laid the insurance documents on the table. They asked him to explain why every member of his family had died shortly after being insured. Chen Ruiqin simply shrugged. He said tragedy had followed him his entire life. According to him, he was just an unlucky man. But investigators had already learned something about Chen Ruiqin. He was patient, careful, and extremely calculating, which meant if he really had committed those crimes, proving it in court would be incredibly difficult. But detectives were determined to uncover the truth, because if their suspicions were correct, Chen Ruiqin was not just a murderer. He was something far more terrifying, a man who had spent 20 years quietly killing the people closest to him. And Chen Yanlin might only be his latest victim. After the discovery of the insurance documents, investigators realized something chilling. If their suspicions were correct, Chen Ruiqin had been killing for nearly 20 years. But suspicion alone was not enough. To bring him to justice, detectives needed solid evidence. So they made a bold decision. They would reopen the old cases. The deaths of Chen Ruiqin's wives and sons had all been ruled accidents years earlier. But now, investigators began reviewing those cases again. Old police reports were pulled from dusty archives. Autopsy files were re-examined. Witnesses were contacted once more. And slowly, disturbing inconsistencies began to surface. In the case of his first wife, neighbors recalled hearing a violent argument the night before she fell down the stairs. In the case of his second wife, witnesses said Chen Ruiqin had been the last person seen with her near the river. But the most heartbreaking discoveries involved his children. Medical experts reviewing the records began to suspect that at least one of the boys had been poisoned before his death. At the time, no one had questioned it. But now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. As investigators gathered more evidence, they began a strategy designed to break Chen Ruiqin's composure. They didn't rush. Instead, they slowly confronted him with the facts. First, the Rolex watch, then the phone records linking him to Chen Yanlin, then the insurance documents. Piece by piece, the evidence was placed in front of him. For days, Chen Ruiqin remained silent. His expression barely changed, but investigators noticed something subtle. Each time they mentioned his sons, his hands trembled slightly. It was the first crack in the mask. Finally, after hours of questioning on the fourth day of interrogation, Chen Ruiqin spoke. First, his voice was calm, but what he said shocked everyone in the room. He admitted that he had lured Chen Yanlin to meet him on the day she disappeared. He had promised to discuss a business investment for her restaurant. But the meeting had another purpose. Chen Ruiqin had discovered that Yanlin owned valuable jewelry, and he needed money. When she arrived at the remote hillside location, he attacked her. After killing her, he took her jewelry and left the body hidden among the bushes. But the most disturbing part of his confession came next. When detectives asked about his wives and sons, Chen Ruiqin lowered his head. Then he quietly admitted something that stunned the investigators. Those deaths had not been accidents. He had carefully planned them, each one, for the insurance money. For nearly 20 years, Chen Ruiqin had lived two lives. To neighbors and friends, he was a tragic figure, a man who had lost his family to terrible misfortune. But behind that image, he had been a calculating killer, a man willing to destroy the lives of the people closest to him for financial gain. Investigators later described him as one of the most cold-blooded criminals they had ever encountered. When the case finally went to court, the evidence was overwhelming. The confession, the insurance policies, the forensic findings, and the stolen jewelry belonging to Chen Yanlin. After months of legal proceedings, the court reached its verdict. Chen Ruiqin was found guilty of multiple murders. The judge described his crimes as exceptionally cruel and premeditated. In the end, he received the maximum sentence allowed by law. For the families of the victims, the verdict brought some measure of justice. But it could never erase the pain. 2 wives, 3 children, and an innocent woman named Chen Yanlin. All of them had trusted the same man, and all of them had paid the ultimate price. Cases like this remind us of a disturbing truth. Sometimes the most dangerous people are not strangers hiding in the shadows. Sometimes they are the people who appear kind, polite, and trustworthy. The ones who blend perfectly into everyday life. And that is what made Chen Ruiqin so terrifying. For nearly 20 years, no one realized that behind his calm smile was a man capable of killing his own family.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos.